What can we do to bring accountability to policing for the sake of both the public and police officers themselves? Today, we're talking with special guest Jeff Wenniger, a retired LAPD lieutenant who spent more than 30 years in law enforcement and is now an advocate for how to reimagine policing, grounded in trust, integrity, and true community partnership. We're also joined by IJ senior attorney Patrick Jaicomo, who leads IJ's efforts to dismantle the legal doctrines that block accountability for police officers and other government officials. I'm Kim Norberg of the Institute for Justice. Co-host Keith Neely and I are talking to Jeff and Patrick about why policing needs more accountability, what cops really think about qualified immunity, and how we can make policing better for everyone. This is Beyond the Brief. Jeff, can you tell us a bit about your background as a police officer and what you're doing now to sort of reimagine policing?
Well, I think my background as a police officer begins long before I became a police officer, because my background personally is quite unique. I was adopted, and I had a brother who was also adopted. He's Japanese, and I had a foster sister who's black. And I was raised in Kent, Ohio, and my father was a sociology professor at Kent State. So the experience of growing up in a multiracial family, it impacted how I viewed my profession as a law enforcement professional. And it was very unique, and I would say that I saw things through a different lens than my peers in law enforcement did. So what I ultimately had decided to do was be a professor of criminal justice. And my father encouraged me, rather than go straight into my PhD program, to go get 5 years of practical law enforcement experience at a large law enforcement agency. He felt that that would make me a much more credible professor, but more importantly, it'd make my studies much more rewarding. So that's what I did, and that's why I went out to LA. In the late 80s, there was a recession in the Midwest. Although I had tested with Columbus and Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, I was put on lists, but they weren't hiring. So I was kind of forced to look elsewhere, and the West Coast was hiring hand over fist. And I was hired by both the LA County Sheriff's Department and the LAPD. Originally, I wanted to be LAPD. This was back when the movie Colors, Robert Duvall and Sean Penn, and I thought, what a cool organization to work for. So that's what I wanted to do, but I had some experiences relative to background investigator, sergeant, who pulled me aside and said, hey, I see that you were hired by the LA County Sheriffs. You're a fool if you don't take that job. I thought, that's interesting. And I had another experience where a friend of mine who had grown up in LA was testing with the Sheriff's Department. His father is a retired sergeant from the LAPD and wouldn't allow his son to apply with LAPD. And I thought, maybe there's something here going on. So I chose to be an LA County Sheriff. So I did 3 years with the sheriffs. I did all the custody time. And although that was experience that I'm glad I had, I needed to move on. So that's where I lateraled over to LAPD, and I ended up doing over 30 years with the LAPD.
Oh, wow.
And when I was young, wanted to be challenging myself, and I said I want to be assigned to 77th Division. That's where the riots broke out, the Rodney King riots. And I began my policing career on the streets in those neighborhoods, and it was quite challenging. And then I proceeded on to promote to Metropolitan Division, which is the tactical prowess of the organization. It's a SWAT and a canine and special forces, essentially, of the organization. Then from there, I promoted to sergeant, and I worked Rampart Division, and there was a huge Rampart scandal where the crash unit had a lot of corruption that was going on. Had an officer that was stealing pounds of cocaine out of evidence lockup and selling on the streets for financial gain, committing bank robberies off duty.
Jeez.
Being involved in officer-involved shootings and planting guns to justify the shootings. It was the most egregious police corruption you possibly could have. And I was identified and selected to be part of the new management team at Rampart Division to change that culture. And I wasn't there long before they put me in charge of the new gang unit. It was called the Gang Enforcement Detail. And that replaced the crash unit that they had disbanded citywide because of the corruption. And I was in charge of that unit for 3 years and had to change the measures of effectiveness and ultimately the culture of that entity in policing the violent crime that the gangs commit. And we were very successful. Some of the things that I changed, I thought outside the box, and it was quite unique and it was challenging to implement, but it was recognized. We got the meritorious unit citation, and I was working under Chief William Bratton at the time, who had been the commissioner of NYPD before becoming the chief of police with LAPD, and he brought me in to work directly for him. And what I did was I would brief him on all lethal force and officer-involved shooting incidents, and I wrote his rationale for the adjudication of those cases that was submitted to the Honorable Board of Police Commissioners, who are the ultimate adjudicators of those cases. And I did that for 6 years, and then I went over to become the officer in charge of the detective entity that investigates those. So I had my hands in over 700 cases.
Wow.
Either the adjudication or the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. That's really different from where you started out planning to go, right? What was it about your early experiences at the LA Sheriff and early experiences in LAPD that made you decide to do that as a career instead of going into being a professor?
Well, it's really what I saw was a cultural deficiency in law enforcement. Law enforcement tends to be rather insular, and it's kind of a them versus us mentality.
Sure.
When you'd have these critical incidents that would occur and a police officer perhaps would take the life of somebody, that saying of, bad things happen to people that make bad decisions. And it just really was covering up really the deficiencies of law enforcement. And whether it was deficiencies in who we hire, how we train, the culture, because I would suggest, I call it the gap between the culture and the actual practice and policy and procedure. If the policy and procedure and culture are not aligned, culture is always going to win out. And culture is the actions, not what's on paper.
Sure.
It's the actions that we see consistently. And I saw consistently throughout my career, whether I was a police officer, a sergeant, or a lieutenant, that we had this huge gap that needed to be filled. And I just found it interesting to take on the challenge of trying to assert myself to effectively make these changes, these actionable solutions to make these changes so law enforcement could be successful. And that's why I ended up sticking around for 33 years and 4 months.
Wow. And kind of coming full circle, you started out wanting to be an academic, then you go and you spend, 30 plus years working in policing. And now you've kind of come back a little bit to the academic side. You've written a book, I understand, kind of talking about the experiences that you had and kind of how it's informed your view of maybe how we can change policing. And could you talk a little bit about, I know, you said your dad encouraged you to go to get that practical experience before you become an academic. Did that ring true for you? I mean, it sounds like this is a book that you couldn't have written when you first set out 30 years ago and looking into criminal justice. How did your perspective change over the course of your career?
Well, really, the platform that I have now is a result of the experience that I had for those 33 years. So that was really, those 33 years was my internship. It's really what has given me the credibility to speak and say the things that I'm saying, because I'm not going to share just my personal opinion with you.
Right.
I can substantiate it with experiences, with empirical evidence of research. I've gone outside of the insular culture of law enforcement here in the United States, where we tend not to look not only outside of our own country to best practices, but we oftentimes don't even look outside of our own organization. And the reality is, I went over to London and I looked at the Metropolitan London Police. I went over to Paris, France. I've looked at the things that they do, how their mentality and how their mindset is different than ours here in the United States. I looked at the Nordic countries and what their hiring practices are and their training practices are, and what you have to achieve before you even put one boot on the ground and engage in your first act as a police officer. They require 2 and 3 years of training, the equivalent of an undergraduate degree, along with the police training. And why is that important? The empirical evidence suggests that education is key to be an effective law enforcement officer. People with 4-year degrees and higher have 40% less incidents of force, 40% less personnel complaints. They're better critical thinkers. They have better moral reasoning. It's almost to the point where you're negligent as a police executive if you're not requiring or encouraging education of your people. Now, the argument would be law enforcement already has a challenge in regards to the hiring pool that they have.
Sure.
So how can we require a 4-year degree? And I would say there's validity to that argument. But what I'm suggesting is that we don't require a 4-year degree to get hired, that we incorporate that into our training. Here in the United States, there is not a national standard for the amount of training you're required to have before you become a sworn police officer. The average is 800 hours. And I would like to put that in context for you. In order for you to apply for your cosmetology license,
right,
you need 1,500 hours.
That doesn't seem
we know
well
a lot
matched.
about that. Yeah.
There's nothing else needs to be said as far as I'm concerned. And then the training that you receive, it's not to make sure that you're competent and will be successful in handling a rapidly unfolding tactical scenario. It's a box that's getting checked so the organization and the city or the entity that you work for can say that they did their due diligence and they're not liable because you were trained in this. But
we know a thing or two about that too.
That's also true.
Yeah. So it's, the reality is yes, when you're in the academy, you have to demonstrate a minimum proficiency in various areas. And an example I'll give you is grappling. The data shows that 85% of physical altercations within the first 30 seconds end up on the ground. So as a police officer, is it likely that you're going to get involved in a physical altercation? Yes. So then therefore, is it likely that it's going to go to the ground? Yes. If you're not proficient in your grappling and you're not doing things to maintain that proficiency, then you're not likely to be successful. And if you're not confident in your grappling techniques, what are you going to resort to? Your gun. So in the state of California, every 2 years you get 4 hours of perishable skills training in grappling. Do you think that's going to make you proficient in the event?
4 hours every 2 years, so 2 hours a year, essentially?
No, it would just be a 4-hour block every 2 years.
Just a 4-hour block. You can't even split it up. 4 hours every 2 years.
Yeah. So it's a real void in training. So we're talking about how we hire, how we train, the militarization shift in law enforcement, where that impacts the mindset of an officer. If you're wearing this exterior tack vest, ballistic vest with all these tools on it,
pulling up in a tank, basically.
You can't help but have that impact subconsciously, even what you see as your role. And this is why it's so important. If you look at just officer-involved shootings, in law enforcement in the United States, there are about 1,050 people approximately killed every year in officer-involved shootings by police officers. 1/3 of officer-involved shootings involve somebody suffering a mental health crisis. And if you look at the training that we have historically, it's hypervigilant on the threat, on the threat, on the threat. And we are not doing enough where officers understand the impact that their mere presence and the pointing of their weapon and the beanbag and the taser laser on the chest of the person you're trying to obtain compliance from, and multiple people yelling conflicting commands. How would that impact you? You would be
terrifying.
Yeah. Now, add the mental health crisis to that. So why are we shocked that it involves somebody engaging in an action that we justify we felt required us to use lethal force? Because we believed or we feel we were objectively reasonable in our perception that we had to use lethal force to protect ourselves from serious bodily injury or death. Right. And we don't do enough to change our mindset and what is our role here. And we need to move away from having this, I don't even like the term law enforcement. I think it's public safety. Mm-hmm. Public safety better captures what really law enforcement should be doing in conjunction with mental health, with housing, with mentorship. All of these things are required in order to ensure and maximize our ability to provide public safety. Mm-hmm. And if we look at it that way, from the 10,000-foot perspective, then we're not inclined, like we have done historically in law enforcement, where we think we can solve everything. Mm-hmm. We can't. We don't have the expertise in all of these areas to be successful. But unfortunately, we say we can, which is then justification for hiring more officers, larger organization, more power for the union. Right. And it's all about, you got to ask yourself a question. What is this about? Power? Is it about justice, or is it about humanity?
Yeah.
And really things have gone towards power, and size is power, and numbers is power. And I even talk about it in my book. We need to rethink how we reimagine mm-hmm. the policing model that we use.
Yeah, I think certainly over the last century plus, the amount of mission creep we've seen and the expectations we have for what police should do and all the things that they need to be involved with has gotten so large that it's unreasonable to expect that any single person could be competent to do those things, even if they were sort of this, platonically virtuous individual who had all the skills necessary. So, I mean, that seems obviously true and something that everyone understands. And the question is just sort of how can we unwind those? Mm-hmm. But I'm also interested to hear more, given your experience during the time you were in LAPD. That was really the whole window when police militarization went from 0 to 60. And I think LAPD was one
60?
of the... I'm trying to keep things within the bounds of the law here, sir. And I think, LA was probably one of the epicenters of where that happened. You had that bank shooting with the high-powered rifles and the body armor that sort of spurred this beginning of the discussion, and now we've come through all of the stuff Radley Balco's talked about, and the Department of Defense shifting all of these war weapons into the hands of civil law enforcement officers. And so I would be interested a little more specifically in hearing what sort of impact you observed that having on the psychology of officers in those positions, especially because you were working with some of the folks involved in these tactical operations.
Well, I actually had personal experience with the LAPD. I worked the military acquisition team, where I went around to various military bases in California, and basically my direction was go find some good stuff.
Wow, yeah.
So, and you could get airplanes and grenades and utilities, you name it, you could get it. And all it required was filling out forms. Wow. And I'm not here to tell you that we don't need some of these equipment in certain circumstances. The problem is that it's bled into everyday operations of policing, and that's where there's the breakdown. And it can't help but change the mentality that law enforcement officers have in regards to their mindset and what they view their role as. And I want to give you something that's real current. Let's look at what happened just this past spring in Los Angeles, when you had the deployment of the National Guard and the Marines, and you had the demonstrations in downtown Los Angeles. And to give you a little bit of understanding of the historical background there, you had back in 2020, when they had the George Floyd riots there, there was an excessive use of less lethal munitions, which is beanbag rounds and those sorts of things. And it resulted in some legislation in the state of California that essentially eliminated the use of that except for very strict circumstances. And you fast forward to this past spring and you see the number of rounds that were fired and how they were so indiscriminately fired. in violation of the law. And it's even when things are codified and it's clearly stated by law what you can and can't do, you're still not seeing a shift in the behaviors of the law enforcement agency.
I think that's I was going to say this is a perfect juncture. I think we've been talking a lot about these systemic issues, and we've been talking a lot about how, simply making something illegal isn't often enough because the incentives just aren't there to hold officers accountable when they violate those principles. We've talked a lot on this show about qualified immunity. Patrick, could you kind of give our viewers, I'm sure they already know a lot about this if they've been watching, but give a quick refresher on how qualified immunity figures into all this?
Yeah, so qualified immunity, of course, is an immunity that was created by the Supreme Court. The version that exists today was created in 1982 in a court case called Harlow versus Fitzgerald, which was actually about Nixon aides that were retaliating against a whistleblower who'd testified before Congress. So nothing related to police. It was actually against federal officials, and that is sort of dripped its way into the bathtub overflowing now. And so this is something that protects every government official at every level and every type. And of course, many of those officials are police officers because they're the people that interact the most from the government perspective to the everyday person perspective. And so the way that this doctrine works is, as a default, if a government official violates your constitutional rights, they're immune from suit unless you, the victim of the abuse, can point to an earlier case involving substantially similar facts where a court had held that the actions at issue were unconstitutional. And so to give you an example of how silly and absurd this can be in practice, there's a case from California called Jessup versus City of Fresno, where some police officers were executing a search warrant at a house and they stole more than $100,000 in coins and cash. And when they were sued for violating the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on unreasonable seizures, the Ninth Circuit said, well, actually, there's no case in the Ninth Circuit that says this is unconstitutional. Sure, and they actually say this in a footnote. It's true across time and geography that everyone knows that stealing is wrong, and we teach it to our children. But it's not clearly established, and that is the legal watchword for qualified immunity. And so it's become this completely technical game of constitutional whack-a-mole where the police don't know what's clearly established, and the victims of the abuse don't know what's clearly established. Lawyers like me and whoever's representing the government get to go into court and have these fancy arguments where we fight about this thing that nobody who's actually involved in the process is able to comprehend ex ante. And so it is like this completely technical, made-up doctrine the Supreme Court created that has no practical effect, that doesn't protect officers who are doing the right thing. It just protects officers whose lawyers are able to concoct the best explanation for why this case is different from that case. And that's the world in which we live. And I would love to hear, more perspective from the other side of this. But I want to say, too, I thought that the observation from Jeff about the culture being the thing that matters because policy is always going to be subordinate to culture. That's from the inside looking out. From the outside looking in, I would say that's exactly right. And I would say that's why it's so important for us as plaintiffs' attorneys or as people who sue the government for these abuses to be able to hold them accountable. Because fundamentally, the culture is controlling policy internally because culture is enforceable. If you have a policy and every police officer on the squad hates it, and you follow it as another police officer, that's not going to end well for you. People are not going to like you. They're going to be mean to you at best. So well, I'm not going to follow the policy because everyone will hate me and they'll be mean to me. On the other side, if I'm looking at you saying like you can't do this because the Constitution says you can't, and the others and the officer's perspective is, yeah, well, I can actually do it. You can tell me I can't, but the court's going to let me get away with it. It's the same sort of dynamic at play. And so I thought that was a really important observation to see both from the inside and the outside looking at the problems. The fundamental issue is what is going to be enforceable. And you can write up the most perfect policy. You can write the most wonderful statutes about how you're supposed to execute a no-knock raid or how many seconds you need to give before you kick in the door or under what circumstances you're allowed to use lethal force. None of that matters if the culture is out of place because there's no mechanism for accountability on that side or if there's no ability to hold someone accountable in a court of law. And unfortunately, modern policing suffers from both of those problems being so dominant that the policy and the law is really sort of a second-order problem.
Did you know IJ represents ordinary people, free of charge, as they fight back against government abuse? If you're looking for a rewarding way to support our work, consider becoming a member of our merry band of monthly donors and stand shoulder to shoulder with IJ's clients every month of the year. Monthly donations are convenient and cost-efficient, meaning more of your money goes directly to our fight for freedom and justice. Sign up to donate today at ij.org/monthly.
Jeff, I see you nodding. How does that resonate with you? Like, what do you see the role of accountability being in sort of law enforcement or public safety culture?
Well, accountability essentially is everything when it comes to culture. And the experience I had in the adjudication of lethal force cases brought this to the forefront in my observation. So let's look at some realities. That when you have allegations of excessive force when people have been killed by the police, less than 1% of those result in any type of criminal prosecution. So that's quite low. Mm-hmm. Probably even more concerning when you're talking about excessive force allegations made by citizens, only 8% of those are sustained, which means the department finds credibility of the person making the complaint, only 8%. And then you have to also look at the reality that only about 30% of excessive force cases are actually reported because people have such low expectation that they're going to be taken seriously and that it's even going to matter.
Wow.
So why report something that is not going to go anywhere anyway? So that's the reality of the environment that we're working in, not only in law enforcement, but the society that is being policed by this law enforcement entity. So when you're looking at circumstances of an organization holding their people accountable, it's not likely to occur to the extent that the public's expectation will be met so that the proper trust will be built. So if internally it's not happening, there has to be a mechanism externally. And when you're talking about criminal prosecution, that's a high bar. Mm-hmm. Beyond a reasonable doubt. The DA has to say, this is winnable.
Right.
So that can impact why we have such a low percentage of incidents where that's the direction or the way they proceed. But a civil lawsuit and holding officers accountable is a much lower standard. It's preponderance of the evidence. And as Patrick explained, it's essentially impossible to hold officers accountable. Now, I'm going to tell you that I 100% support some type of mechanism being put into place to protect officers from erroneous lawsuits and those sorts of things. That absolutely has to be addressed. But the current state of things has excessively protected officers and not held them accountable. And when you're not holding people accountable, it's not built into the culture. Mm-hmm. The more accountability you have, the better the culture will be because it's going to be influenced by that accountability.
What would that system look like? I mean, it obviously wouldn't be the system that we have now. It wouldn't be nothing, right? And so what would sort of the accountability mechanism look like? What would the sort of, limited shield for police look like?
Well, what I would say to police officers, because the vast majority of police officers are going to tell you, qualified immunity, we have to have it. And it's because they don't really understand it. They don't understand it to the extent how Patrick explained it in regards to having a case that's already pre-existing in order to be able to move forward. That is not workable. Mm-hmm. It's not even realistic. So most officers just look at it as a protection. It's them versus us. Mm-hmm. We have to have these barriers, our armor to protect us from them. Mm-hmm. And them is really the people who you're protecting. I mean, the reality is that the police are only able to perform their duties to the extent that the public will accept their actions. And the reality is that they miss that. That's where the trust has to be built. And we have to have a mechanism in place where if you can identify and establish that someone's constitutional rights have been violated, well, as a law enforcement officer, I've always said, a good cop is not going to be harder on a bad cop more than anybody. They want a bad cop to be held accountable.
Right.
And so if someone's violating someone's constitutional rights, and you can establish that, that should be the threshold of whether you can hold people accountable. Now, the argument's going to be, well, no one's going to want to be a police officer if they run the risk of losing everything in a lawsuit and that sort of things. Well, you have to build all that sort of thing in where you have perhaps limits on payments. But, currently they hide behind knowing that the city's going to pay out or the jurisdiction that they work for.
Patrick, you've talked about some of these mechanisms before. I think, Jeff, you mentioned them as mechanisms that exist to ensure that sort of the frivolous allegations go away, but that the viable ones can be adjudicated. I know that you've mentioned that some of these already exist. Could you talk a little bit about kind of some of the existing mechanisms and what it would look like if qualified immunity did go away?
Yeah, so to touch on a few things that Jeff mentioned that I think the first one and the most important is that all of these problems are multivariable problems. So there isn't a panacea. As much as we want to talk about qualified immunity and Jeff might want to talk about internal policy changes, or prosecutors might want to say, hey, we need to figure out a way to reduce the conflicts of interest in deciding whether to prosecute police or other government officials. All of these things work together, and they're the thing that's fundamentally producing the problem that we're seeing. And so what we need to appreciate when we look at any of these circumstances is that we should never, A, let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and B, that we should never think, well, there's one simple problem here. If I can just pull this one lever, everything will be okay, because that's almost never true in reality, and it's certainly not going to be true in this particular instance. But on the question of qualified immunity, my observation is Jeff's absolutely right. I think most police, or in all of the discussions when we talk about lobbying or we talk about, just educating the public about this doctrine, this has become, especially unfortunately after the Black Lives Matter protests, this galvanized pro-cop or anti-cop position on qualified immunity. It wasn't that before because nobody knew about qualified immunity until 5 years ago, even though it's existed for more than half a century. So most police, I think, like most normal people, also see qualified immunity as, it's a protection for cops to make reasonable mistakes. And we, of course, don't want reasonable mistakes to result in, ruinous fines on police and them losing their houses. In that simple observation, there are several errors that are embedded. First is that reasonable police shouldn't have to worry anyway, because you can't reasonably violate the Fourth Amendment. If you act reasonably, there's no constitutional violation. And of course, almost all constitutional claims against police are going to fall within the Fourth Amendment or the First Amendment, which almost always has a Fourth Amendment aspect to it, because we're talking about you getting arrested, you getting beat up, your family member getting killed, something along these lines. All these fall within the Fourth Amendment. And so there, the founders very wisely, 250 years ago, put in reasonableness, because that's really all that we're looking for. This is a concept in the law that's always been difficult to define, but something we were all kind of happy with because it allowed the flexibility necessary to do difficult things and to confront difficult circumstances and to make sure that there is some amount of deference given to the actions of people under difficult facts. And so the other piece of it that's built in is this idea that, well, we couldn't get people to be cops because they would have to risk losing it all for a mistake or maybe a frivolous case brought by some greedy plaintiff's lawyer or whatever. There's a bunch of legal mechanisms already that exist to prevent these sorts of things. There are frivolous filing rules, there's motions for summary judgment, there's motions to dismiss, there's a bunch of other sanctionable activity that you can engage in. Now, none of these are perfect. And that's true across the board. I could sue Keith today for some made-up thing, and it'd be a real hassle for him to get it thrown out as frivolous, even though it would be frivolous. And that's just part of the system that we all live underneath, unfortunately. But I appreciate that police in particular are concerned with that, because unlike Keith here, who's probably not going to get sued by me, if you're going out there...
I hope not. Our offices are right next to each other. It would be so awkward.
You got some cool stuff in there.
Yeah, that's true.
but police are walking around dealing with people who are having the worst day of their life, and they're doing it at scale. And so you can appreciate the fear that one of those people will be able to find a less savory lawyer who might bring a BS case, and that's a problem. There are mechanisms for that. None of them are perfect. And so that brings me to the third point, which is this idea of these bad lawsuits financially ruining people and making them not want to be police. At the end of the day, Joanna Schwartz's research and others have shown that 99+% of the time, even if you can get through all these other hurdles, the frivolous filings, the motions to dismiss, the qualified immunity, you're able to convince a judge or jury that this was a constitutional violation and damages are awarded, those are going to be paid by the city anyway. I do think that in some instances it would make sense to either codify or more clearly explain to police that if you're held liable for doing something like this and we think you were doing what we told you to do, we will make sure that we're the ones writing the check. In reality, that's what's happening anyway, but I think police need to understand that that's what's going on. I think there's a lot of fear-mongering coming from police unions and other organizations that have different interests that are not quite aligned with the police, who are telling them you should be afraid of this. When I go lobby about, hey, we need to create a cause of action that allows constitutional violations to be vindicated, not just against police, but against all government officials, the police unions come and they oppose it for the reasons we're discussing. The firefighters come because the police came, and that's just the thing that happens. But the people fundamentally behind these things are the municipal leagues, the cities, the places that have to write the checks, because at the end of the day, what it's about is they don't want to write the checks. And so they'll whip the police up into saying, if this happens, you guys will lose your houses and they'll take your cars away. That's not even true. But we could assuage those concerns in different ways. And so IJ's model at the state level for how to deal with this is to put liability on the government employer. So at no point are you, the police officer, or you, the firefighter, or you, the tax bureaucrat, at risk of any sort of personal liability, because fundamentally the concern that we're concerned about at the Institute for Justice is giving the victim of abuse a remedy. That's the thing that's the most important. It's not about teaching the police or the IRS agent a lesson. That's secondary to the fact that your rights are enforceable. And this is sort of the corollary to what we talked about earlier. Enforceability, that's the problem. Accountability in these terms means enforceability. If you can't enforce the policy on the culture, the policy is meaningless. If you can't enforce the policy through legal mechanisms, the policy is meaningless. And by policy here, we're talking about the laws and the Constitution of the United States. These are important things. But again, all of this is much more difficult than anybody wants to give it credit for being, because it's a lot harder to talk about if you want to get into the actual nuances of the problem.
It seems like, this mechanism that you're talking about where, right now cities kind of do this sort of quietly, I guess, but if this were formally the law where they're sort of, I don't know, is indemnifying the right word?
Yeah, it is.
There we go, using a lawyer word.
Well done.
Thanks. But cities are sort of indemnifying their employees against this action. Jeff, if that were a more formal policy, how would that affect some of the things that you were talking about earlier about hiring and training and things like that? Like, would cities change the way that they're doing hiring? Would they be kind of more likely to discipline or fire someone who's, costing them all this money all the time? Like, does that change anything from the city's perspective?
Well, unfortunately, I believe everything comes down to dollars and cents.
Sure.
And most decisions relative to how a police organization hires and trains comes down to dollars and cents. It's very expensive to train people effectively. Mm-hmm. However, I would suggest and argue that it's more expensive to not do so.
Right.
Because of the litigation you're going to have to settle and those sorts of things. So it can have an impact for insightful police executives. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I'm going to be honest, we don't have enough insightful police executives.
Yeah, I think another feature here that goes sort of under discussed is we're talking about dollars and cents in the form of, okay, well, the city will have to write a check, and the check will have to go to the plaintiffs in this case, or the city will have to write a check, and the check will have to go to the defense counsel that we hired to defend the police officer, or whatever. Those are important costs, and of course, they're going to be considered. But I think the thing that's under-considered in a sort of Bastiat type of way is the costs that already exist. Because even though it's not perfect, the reason why money damages are the default in these cases is because we're saying, look, if somebody beats you and it causes all these harms in your life, we can't unbeat you. All we can do is give you money to sort of compensate for that. And when the money isn't given to the person, the costs that exist don't go away. And so by having all these mechanisms that create unenforceability, that allow for all these things to happen that have no remedy in American law, the costs all exist in society. They're just borne by the innocent victims of the abuses. And so, I mean, I think this also goes back to the idea of how these things are actually mirroring, which is you have, the police on the one side who may be trying to do their best, and you have on the other side people that may, for some fortuitous reason, end up on the wrong side of a government abuse. And in any case, like, what is happening there is creating costs on society, on individuals, on anything else. Some of those are monetary, some aren't, but the only way we've been able to square that circle is by giving money damages. And now the decision of who has to write those checks or whether they get written at all creates these additional complications. But at the end of the day, the costs exist in society. They're just borne by different people. And the problem is, because of public choice theory or something else, the individual people are disparate. We can't sort of create a coalition of people who might get beat up by a police officer who then are able to lobby effectively. And so what happens instead is it's very easy to lobby on behalf of a police organization where there's a union, and a government organization of government organizations will lobby because they have a direct interest. And so the costs exist. They're just unseen by, the people who write the checks.
To sort of wrap up, Jeff, is there anything viewers can do if they want to see the kind of transformation in policing that we've discussed? Like, how can people watching this or listening to this help?
Well, the reality is that the police are the people and the people are the police. Mm-hmm. And everybody needs to understand that, and that you do have, and you're empowered to do something. And it involves your ability to elect people that have positions that are going to hold law enforcement accountable in their view of how an organization should be established and how the leaders of that organization are going to be held accountable. Because where you don't have the chief of police being held accountable to crime, the number of personnel complaints, the amount of civil liability that's being paid out, if you're not judging them by those standards, which by and large we're not, then you're never going to be influencing the decisions that are going to best proceed in a manner where the trust of the public is going to be built, which is a benefit to law enforcement. Law enforcement needs to understand that. It's no different than a relationship, a marriage that you're in. If the two parties don't trust each other, the relationship is never going to be good. So the trust has to be built, and it starts with accountability. Whether it's accountability of the actions of officers that are where their boots meet the ground on the pavement, answering the radio calls and handling all of these rapidly unfolding tactical scenarios, or it's the accountability of the police executives that are ultimately responsible for the culture of that organization. Mm-hmm. And it's not enough, as we spoke earlier, that you just have policy and procedures on paper. They're just words. If you have a circumstance where you have an officer-involved shooting and you have a certain behavior that's observed, but it didn't end in a bad way, if you're not holding them accountable for the act, not for the ultimate end result, then you're creating a bad culture. Because when it does go bad, the officer's going to shrug his shoulders and say, I've done this a dozen times and I was rewarded for it. Mm-hmm. So it's about holding the leadership accountable, and the best way to do that is through the ballot box, ensuring that the people that you're voting in as mayors and city leaders, as city council, and these people that are in the positions to ask these police executives these questions, to hold them accountable to the culture that they're creating.
Well, and speaking of empowering people, I know we at IJ have launched our own sort of grassroots effort, Americans Against Qualified Immunity. Patrick, could you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, so, at IJ, of course, we're a law firm first and foremost, so we litigate these issues, but we also have, a lot of other things we do that go outside of litigation. I mentioned earlier the lobbying we do to sort of get better laws put in place that would create accountability and put the accountability with the correct people, which is, in our opinion, the government employers. Which, by the way, the fact that you have to sue individual government employees is really a feature that the government created by giving itself sovereign immunity. And this is a 100-year story, so we don't have time to get into it for this podcast, but it is very silly that like so many of these other things, we're just building on bad foundations and having to build back in the right direction so this tower doesn't fall over completely. But in addition to our litigation and our lobbying work, we do activism work through Americans Against Qualified Immunity in this particular space. And of course, that is meant to sort of create the large interest group that we talked about earlier. We have less disparate interest if we can coalesce people around the fundamental problem and say, look, we understand that policing is difficult. Some of the people at AAQI might not like police. Plenty of them love police. A lot of us recognize the importance of policing. It's impossible to have laws if laws can't be enforced. In fact, that's the thing I'm complaining about, is in terms of being able to sue police officers for violating the Constitution. And so if you can get a large group of people like Americans Against Qualified Immunity together, and you can have this large group talk to the relevant policyholders, whether that's your city council here, we're talking about whether that would be your police commissioner or the sheriff in your county or your state representatives or even your federal representatives. The idea is to have a large group of people to say, look, this isn't just me, Patrick. This isn't some egghead discussion despite the way I look. This is about being able to say there's 10,000, 100,000, 1 million people standing behind me who I'm speaking on behalf of. You should take this seriously because the 1 million people behind me care. And that 1 million people needs to be able, like Jeff said, to work with police. Police need to be able to work with them. And because we have this friction, it's making things worse for everybody. And that's the thing that is very difficult to see as someone who's steeped in all of this, is the police are making this harder on themselves. The government is making this harder on itself. And of course, we all know that it's harder on the people who happen to be the recipients of government abuse. If we can root out the bad apples, that's the thing we keep talking about, that will make everyone better off. And I think we talk about bad apples in a way that people have lost sight of the whole phrase, which was that a few bad apples spoils the whole bunch. So if you have a bad apple, all the apples are bad. That's why we need to get them out and keep them out. And the mechanisms culturally that Jeff's talking about are important for doing those things. The mechanisms from accountability on an external level are important. The mechanisms from the criminal side are important. We don't have a prosecutor here to talk about that. Maybe that's a future episode. But again, there are many different variables at play here, and we need to be able to address and adjust all of them so we can reach the best outcome.
You know, I would say this, is that, you know, my book, I talk about reimagined policing. Mm-hmm. And why do I say that? Why do I use that term rather than defund the police or police reform? Because I believe it gives law enforcement the opportunity to impose the change upon itself and navigate the best path forward for success themselves versus having change imposed on them through consent decrees. When something goes terribly wrong and a consent decree comes in and it's imposed on you. I love law enforcement. I bleed blue, and I want law enforcement to be successful moving forward. But it has got to get out of this siloed mentality. And when you're talking about a critical issue that vast majority of people in law enforcement don't even understand, if you were to sit down every chief of police in this country, I would say less than 5% of them could even accurately articulate what qualified immunity is. So how can we have any meaningful conversations and internal modifications relative to how we view this issue? And the reality is that we need to have the courage to have these difficult conversations, which means we have to have conflicting opinions brought to the table, and we can all sit down respectfully and hear the opinions and perspectives of everybody involved. And then and only then will law enforcement be able to navigate that successful path forward. And that is my hope. And that's why I'm sitting here today. That's why I wrote my book. And that's where I hope the future for law enforcement to be, where we as citizens in this country can be proud of our law enforcement organizations and have trust in what they are doing.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, guys, for coming in and talking with us. And thanks to all of you for listening and watching. If you'd like to get more of our videos, you can like or subscribe to this channel. We'll put a link to Jeff's book below. And if you'd like to check out the AAQI project that Patrick mentioned, it's at aaqi.org. And if you'd like to support this work through IJ, you can do that at just $5 a month at ij.org/donate. Thanks so much.
Thanks again for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and tune in for more videos.